They said I was owed nothing more than what the world had already given me, which was a cot in a long room of snoring boys and a name that wasn't my own. The headmaster stood on the raised platform of the dining hall, his voice a dry rustle of paper, his eyes sweeping over us as if we were columns of unfortunate arithmetic. He was a man who believed charity was a transaction, and on our 18th birthdays, the transaction was complete. Most boys were destined for the forge, the rail yard, or the grim discipline of the cavalry. For me, there was only a thin envelope, handed over with a sigh that said my case was finally, thankfully, closed. For you, he announced, his voice loud enough for the entire hall to hear the pity in it, there is a small inheritance. A property left by a distant relative you never knew. The county clerk has filed the deed. A ripple of murmuring went through the room. An inheritance? For one of us? It was a fairy tale. But the headmaster's smile was thin, cruel. It is a barn, he clarified, and the murmuring turned to stifled laughter. A collapsed structure on the far edge of the Blackwater Valley. The land is sour and the well is dry. Consider it a lesson in the nature of hope. He slid the envelope across the table. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, a weight of scorn and amusement. The barn boy. The name was probably sticking to me before I even touched the paper. I took the deed, the paper cool and official in my trembling hand. I didn't look at him. I looked at the smudged ink that spelled out my name, the only thing I truly owned, now tied to a ruin. That night, I read it by the light of a sliver of moon through the grimy dormitory window. It was real. A plot of land. A barn. A joke to them, but to me, it was a period at the end of a long, miserable sentence. It was an exit. My departure was as quiet as my life had been. I owned a spare shirt, a worn blanket, and the deed. The cook, a woman with tired eyes who sometimes slipped me an extra biscuit, pressed a small sack into my hands containing a loaf of bread and a piece of hard cheese. It's a cold valley, she whispered, not meeting my gaze. Be careful of it. I walked out of the institution's gates before dawn, the sound of the heavy iron latch clicking shut behind me feeling less like an expulsion and more like an escape. The road to the Blackwater Valley was little more than a set of ruts carved into the plains. I walked for 2 days, sleeping in ditches, rationing the bread and cheese until it was gone. The valley appeared first as a dark gash in the horizon, a place the sun seemed reluctant to touch. As I descended, the air grew colder, the trees more skeletal. The few folks I passed on the road, hard-faced men on horseback, barely glanced at me. I was just another piece of tumbleweed blowing toward a dead end. I asked for directions at a dusty crossroads store, and the man behind the counter just laughed. The old ruin on the ridge? Son, ain't nothing up there but wind and regret. The ground stone hard. Nothing's grown there in 50 years. He sold me a small tin of matches for a coin I'd kept sewn in my hem, his eyes assessing my thin frame with a finality that mirrored the headmaster's. The final climb to the ridge was punishing. The barn stood silhouetted against a bruised purple sky, exactly as they described it, a skeleton. Its roof was a jagged mouth open to the elements, its walls were missing teeth, great gaps where boards had rotted and fallen away. It was a monument to failure. And it was mine. The first night in my inheritance was a lesson in survival. I found the most sheltered corner, a space where 3 walls still tenuously met, and huddled there in my thin blanket as the temperature plummeted. The wind moaned through the broken slats, a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to be searching for something to tear apart. I was that something. Hunger was a cold, hard knot in my belly. Despair was its companion. I thought of the headmaster's smirk, the boys' laughter, and a different kind of feeling began to burn alongside the cold, a stubborn, stupid anger. This place was meant to break me. It was a punchline to the story of my life. But what if I refused to be the joke? The next morning, fueled by that flicker of defiance, I began to work. Not to rebuild the barn, that was impossible, but to understand it. I cleared away piles of debris, rotten timber, and nests of pack rats. I was looking for anything of value, any tool left behind, any secret this ruin might hold. My hands were raw within an hour. My back ached. The work was pointless, but it was better than freezing. It was in the far corner, under a heap of moldy straw and collapsed planking, that I found it. Not a tool, but a patch of flooring that felt different. Solid. I scraped away the detritus and saw the dark, rusted curve of an iron ring, set flush into a thick slab of wood. It was a trapdoor. It was heavy, swollen with a generation of damp, but I threw my entire weight against it, grunting and straining until, with a groan of tortured wood, it lifted. A wave of cool, earthy air, smelling of deep stone and stillness, washed over me. Below, a set of steep stone steps disappeared into perfect, impenetrable blackness. With my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, I lit one of my precious matches. The flame was a tiny, brave star against the oppressive dark. I held it over the opening. The stone steps were slick with moisture, descending deeper than any root cellar had a right to. The match burned my fingers and I dropped it, the darkness swallowing the light instantly. I needed more. I spent the rest of the day gathering resinous pine knots from the scraggly trees on the ridge, fashioning a crude torch. When I finally descended, the torch held high, the air grew still and cold, the silence absolute. The steps ended in a chamber, larger than I could have imagined. It was not a cellar, it was a cavern, hand-hewn from the bedrock, the walls bearing the rhythmic scars of a pickaxe. It was vast, maybe half the size of the barn above it, with a ceiling just high enough for me to stand upright. In the center of the room was a mound of earth. And on a small, carved-out ledge in the far wall, I saw it. A small, leather-bound book, coated in a fine layer of dust but otherwise perfectly preserved by the dry, cool air. Beside it lay a rusted spade head and a pick, their wooden handles long since rotted away. I picked up the journal. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but legible. It was the diary of a man who had owned this land a lifetime ago. He wrote of the valley's punishing sun in the summer and its killing frosts in the spring and fall. He wrote of his obsession, his grand and secret project to build a garden safe from the tyranny of the seasons. To grow things under the earth, using the deep, constant temperature of the rock to moderate the climate. He had failed. The journal ended abruptly, speaking of a lack of light and a persistent problem with water. But he had left the theory. He had left the beginning. In that cold, dark, silent place, holding the story of another man's failure, I felt the first true spark of hope I had ever known. It was a mad idea, born of desperation and a ghost's dream. It was perfect. The next months were a blur of single-minded, back-breaking labor. My life shrank to the dimensions of that hole in the ground. I had a new purpose, to finish what the man in the journal had started. First, I needed to expand the space. I fashioned a new handle for the old pickaxe head and began to chip away at the rock and soil. The sound of the pick striking stone became the rhythm of my days. I hauled the earth out bucket by bucket, dumping it in a far corner of the ruined barn above. My hands, once the soft hands of an orphan, became calloused and hard, my muscles taut and strong. I was shaping the earth, and it was shaping me. The journal had identified the problems, light and water. The water came first, by accident. While expanding a section of the cavern, my pick broke through a thin layer of shale and a tiny, steady trickle of water began to seep from the rock. It was clean and cold, filtering through 100 feet of stone. It wasn't a flood, but it was enough. I carved a small basin to collect it, a reservoir for my future garden. Light was the greater challenge. I spent the last of my coins in town on 2 lanterns and a large can of oil. The storekeeper looked at me with open curiosity. "Gonna be a long winter, boy. A couple lanterns ain't gonna keep you from freezing up on that ridge." I just nodded and paid. I didn't tell him the lanterns weren't for warmth. Down in the cavern, I hung them from hooks I hammered into the ceiling. Their golden glow pushed back the oppressive darkness, creating 2 small suns in my subterranean world. It wasn't daylight, but it was life. I used the dirt I'd excavated to create long, raised beds, mixing in dried leaves and whatever organic matter I could find to enrich it. I bought seeds with the last of my money, carrots, cabbages, and a few potatoes. Things the seed merchant said were hardy. I planted them with a reverence I'd never felt for anything. My secret garden, buried under a ruin, lit by fire, and watered by a mountain's slow tears. For weeks, nothing happened. I tended my small patch of earth in the lantern light, my hope warring with a gnawing fear. I had staked everything on this gamble. Every night, I'd examine the soil, my heart sinking a little further. The journal had warned that progress would be slow. The light was weak. But the temperature was constant, a cool, stable environment free from the wind and frost that scoured the world above. And then, one morning, I saw it. A tiny spear of green, no bigger than my fingernail, pushing its way out of the dark soil in one of the cabbage rows. I knelt, touching it with a single, trembling finger. It was real. It was alive. Within a week, there were more, a faint green blush across the beds. I watched them with the intensity of a zealot. I talked to them, encouraging them to grow. They were my congregation, my family, my proof that I was not a failure. The first harvest was a holy moment. I pulled a carrot from the loose soil. It was pale, not the vibrant orange of a sun-fed carrot, but it was perfectly formed. I wiped the dirt off on my sleeve and took a bite. It was crisp, shockingly sweet. It was the most delicious thing I had ever tasted, because it was the taste of survival. I had made food out of darkness and rock. I sat there, in the quiet golden glow of my lanterns, surrounded by my pale, beautiful plants, and I ate until I was full. Above me, the first snow of the season began to fall, blanketing the valley in a sheet of white. But down below, in my secret world, it was spring. I had enough food to last the winter. I had done the impossible. The joke was not on me. To survive, I had to be frugal. The lanterns consumed oil, and oil cost money. I had to venture into the valley town every few weeks, a silent ghost in worn clothes, to trade for what I needed. I didn't trade my vegetables, not yet. I sold firewood, bundles of deadfall I gathered from the wooded slopes of the ridge. It was grueling work for a few coins, but it kept my secret safe. It was during one of these trips that I met the old man. He lived alone in a small cabin at the base of the ridge, a wisp of smoke always curling from his chimney. I'd seen him watching me from his porch, his eyes sharp and curious under the brim of a battered hat. One day, he was waiting for me on the path. He was old, his face a roadmap of hard seasons, but his back was straight. He held up a hand, not in threat, but in greeting. "You're the boy from the ruin," he said. It wasn't a question. "I am. Town says you're living on air and stubbornness. But you ain't starving. You ain't even thin. Got a secret, boy?" My heart hammered. I expected accusation, a threat to expose whatever strangeness I was up to. I clutched the small bag of coins in my pocket and said nothing. He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "Don't spook. I ain't the law. Just a man who's seen 100 winters in this valley. Seen men twice your size broken by one. But you're still standing." He took a step closer, his eyes scanning the ridge behind me. "Heard them call this place a curse for as long as I can remember. The old-timers said the ground was poisoned. Looks to me like you found the blessing in it." His words disarmed me. He wasn't suspicious, he was impressed. On an impulse I still don't understand, I decided to trust him. I told him. Not everything, but enough. I told him about the cellar, the idea of growing things away from the frost. He listened, nodding slowly, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he was silent for a long time. Then he said, "That ain't crazy. That's just listening to the ground instead of the fools in town. The earth keeps a steady heart. You just figured out how to feel the pulse." He then gave me a piece of advice that changed everything. "The soil down deep, it's sour," he said. "You need to sweeten it. There's a limestone outcrop on the west face of this ridge. Chip some off, crush it to powder, and mix it in. It'll make all the difference." He saw the potential in my madness and offered not scorn, but wisdom. He was the first person in my entire life who had looked at me and seen not a problem to be solved, but a person worth helping. The old man's advice was a revelation. The crushed limestone worked like a charm, and my next planting of carrots grew thicker and sweeter, the cabbage heads fuller and more robust. I even managed to coax a small crop of pale, but edible, tomatoes to ripen on the vine in the constant, gentle warmth. My subterranean farm was becoming more efficient, more real. But as my hidden world thrived, the world outside began to starve. The harvest in the valley had been meager, weakened by a late frost and a dry summer. As autumn deepened into a harsh, early winter, the whispers in town grew louder and more desperate. My regular trips for lantern oil became ordeals. The storekeeper, a portly man with suspicious eyes, would watch me count out my coins. "Still just buying oil and matches, boy?" he'd ask, his voice carrying through the quiet store. A man can't live on light. One day, I brought a few of my finest cabbages to trade for a new shovel head. He picked one up, his eyes narrowing. "Where'd a boy get a fresh cabbage like this in the middle of November?" The ground's frozen solid. I mumbled something about a cold frame and a lucky spot, but the damage was done. The other customers in the store fell silent, watching me. The preacher, who was there buying flour, stepped forward. He didn't speak to me, but to the room. "The good book tells us to be wary of fruits grown in darkness," he intoned, his voice heavy with meaning. "The earth gives its bounty in the sun, under the eyes of God. What grows without light is unnatural." The word hung in the air like a conviction. Unnatural. From then on, I was marked. Children would sometimes follow me to the edge of town, daring each other to get closer, as if I were a creature from a ghost story. The whispers followed me everywhere. "He has a secret. He's hoarding food. He's doing something wrong up on that ridge." I was an outcast once again, but this time for a reason I couldn't comprehend. I was surviving. And in their eyes, my survival was a sin. The loneliness was a different kind now, colder and sharper than the simple isolation I'd felt before. It was the loneliness of being misunderstood, of having your miracle mistaken for a curse. The first blizzard was a monster. It swept into the valley without warning, a roaring wall of white that buried the world in feet of snow. For 3 days, the wind howled like a hungry wolf, piling drifts against doors and windows, cutting the valley off from the outside world completely. From the broken slats of my barn, I watched the storm erase the landscape, turning everything into a single, undifferentiated field of white. I was safe. Down below, in the quiet warmth of my cavern, my plants grew on, oblivious. I had food, water, and shelter. But as the storm raged, I couldn't shake the image of the faces I'd seen in town, the pinched, worried faces of mothers, the hollowed-out eyes of men who saw their winter stores dwindling. The preacher's words echoed in my mind. Unnatural. Was it? Was it wrong to have this secret abundance when others had nothing? The storm broke on the 4th day, leaving behind a world of brutal, beautiful silence. The cold that followed was bone-deep, a cold that killed. News traveled slowly, carried by the few brave souls who dug themselves out. The miller's family was down to their last sack of flour. The blacksmith had slaughtered his only horse for meat. And then I heard about the widow. Her husband had died in a logging accident the summer before, leaving her with 2 small children in a cabin on the far side of the creek. They had nothing. The story was told in hushed, grim tones at the general store when I went for more oil. They were going to starve. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in the lantern glow, looking at my rows of thriving vegetables. I had enough. More than enough for myself. I had created this place to save myself from the world's indifference. But what was the point of saving yourself if you became as indifferent as the world you were trying to escape? I made a choice. I filled the largest sack I owned with potatoes, carrots, and cabbages. It was heavy, a testament to my success. I pulled on my worn coat, wrapped my face against the biting cold, and stepped out of the barn. The snow was waist-deep in places, the air so cold it felt like breathing shards of glass. The journey to the widow's cabin was a battle, every step a monumental effort. But with each step, the weight on my back felt less like a burden and more like a purpose. I left the sack on the widow's doorstep, knocked once, hard, and then retreated into the snow-dusted trees before she could open the door. I didn't want thanks or questions. I just wanted them to eat. But in a valley as small as ours, there are no secrets for long. The widow, a practical and determined woman named Anna, followed my tracks in the snow the next day. She found her way to my ruined barn, her expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. She didn't see a curse. She saw the miracle it was. "You did this?" she asked, her voice soft with wonder as I showed her the cavern. "You gave us this?" Her gratitude was a warmth that spread through me, chasing away the last of the chill from my journey. She told her story, and it spread faster than any rumor. It wasn't the preacher's version of unnatural darkness, but a story of a boy who had made a garden in the heart of winter. A few days later, the blacksmith came, his big frame stooped with worry. He didn't ask for a handout. He offered to work, to repair my tools, to reinforce the barn structure in exchange for food for his family. I agreed. Then the miller came. Then others. They came not with suspicion, but with a desperate, humbling hope. My secret project became a community's lifeline. We worked together. The blacksmith forged new, stronger tools. The miller helped me devise a grinding stone for the limestone. Anna, the widow, had a gift for organizing, creating a system to distribute the food fairly to the families who needed it most. The cavern echoed with the sounds of shared labor. The storekeeper was the last to come. He arrived one afternoon, his face pale, his shelves at the store completely bare. He stood before me, twisting his hat in his hands, unable to meet my eye. "I was wrong about you, boy," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I have goods. Cloth, nails, oil. I'll trade you for anything you can spare." There was no triumph in his apology, only a shared, weary humanity. I filled a crate for him. Years passed. The underground farm expanded. We dug new chambers, devised systems of mirrors to bounce slivers of daylight down into the darkness, and learned which crops thrived best in our strange, beautiful world. It became the valley's insurance against the harshness of the seasons. The headmaster passed through our valley once, many years later. He was an old man by then, his authority faded. He heard the stories of the thriving community, of the strange farm that fed everyone through the hardest winters. He asked to see me. He stood at the entrance to the cavern, now a proper set of reinforced stairs, and stared into the lantern-lit expanse where dozens of people worked. He looked at me, the boy he had sent to this ruin to learn a lesson about failure. "I don't understand," he said. I looked back at the world I had built, not from what I was given, but from what was discarded. I looked at the families, the children who would grow up knowing that hunger was not inevitable, that a curse could be a blessing in disguise. "You told me I would receive what I was owed," I told him. "You were right. This was owed to me. A chance to build something better than what I was given, and now I ask you, what ruin have you been handed? What plot of sour ground have they told you is worthless? Look closer. Find the trap door. There is a space beneath the world's judgment, waiting for you to pick up a tool and begin. Dig. Create your own light. And see what grows."